Hey students, this is Mr. Moore. I'm back here with your AP review, and I'm currently going over Unit 1 on the Renaissance and Exploration, covering the time period from 1450 to 1648. Although if you've watched some of the other episodes, you'll notice that some of these examples that the College Board have given us do fall outside of that sphere. And maybe I should point out one of the reasons why some of these things fall outside of the sphere of these dates is because these are kind of, they are very important dates, but there's also some arbitrariness to them, meaning that sometimes events will start during one time period and definitely spill over into another. And so what we're going to be focusing on today is topic 1.8. As I've said, I believe in all of my videos, you're able to go to my website and get a copy of this outline. This is exactly given by the College Board, word for word, except that sometimes I will add some of my own commentary to it. So these illustrative examples, I'm kind of elaborating on what the College Board gives us. But the rest of it is word for word from the College Board in what they call a key concept outline. It's really a study guide. And if you'll use this study guide, pause when you're reading this study guide, pause and go look things up, research things you don't know, become familiar with words that they use, and then you'll find studying for the AP test is very doable. It does take time, but once you learn these concepts and kind of mold them into your brain, you should walk away having a very good understanding of world history, not just European history. Something that I point out to my class all the time is why European history is important. European history is not just the history of Europe, because over the last 500 years, Europeans have taken over the planet Earth. As we've been discussing in this review over the last little while, we've been talking about Europeans taking over the Americas. Eventually, they're going to take over Africa and most of Asia, and of course, all of Australia. And so in the end, we must remember always that European history is world history. Like it or not, over the last 500 years, Europeans have dominated the planet Earth. The proof is, I'm giving this broadcast in English, a European language from England, and yet I live in the United States. Canada, the official language of Canada is French and English. French is mostly over here in like Quebec in the eastern side, but English throughout the entire country. In the United States, the dominant language is English, although there is a lot of Spanish. And obviously, if you get down into Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, you'll find a ton of Spanish and English, like Belize is an English-speaking country. In the Caribbean, you'll find French-speaking, like in Haiti, and Spanish in Dominican Republic and Cuba, English in Jamaica, right? And of course, if you go into South America, the dominant side over here is all Spanish-speaking, over here in the West. But of course, there's Portuguese speaking in Brazil, English in Guyana, Dutch in Suriname, and French in French Guyana. So you'll see that every country in North and South America speaks a European language. That's just one example. That's me making a claim and providing evidence to prove that my claim is accurate. European history matters. So as we get into colonial expansion and the Columbian Exchange, there's nothing more important than what I just said to help you understand the impact that Europeans have on the global society. And that's what Learning Objective J gets us to think about. Explain the economic impact of European colonial expansion and development of trade networks. That's exactly what I just said, showing you how Europeans have been taking over the world over the last 500 years. This first bullet point says that the Portuguese established a commercial network along the African coast in South and East Asia and South America in the late 15th and throughout the 16th centuries. Now, this is a chart that I've been using several times in these study guide reviews, And I'm going to go ahead and use it again to remind you of what we just read, that the Portuguese have set up a trading empire along the coast of Africa and across the Indian Ocean, and of course along the coast of South America. And you'll still find Portuguese-speaking countries today. Even if you go to China, and there's a little province of China, a little piece of China, a special administrative region called Macau, it's still Portuguese speaking to this very day. It's right across the bay from Hong Kong. And that's just one more example of how Europeans have been influencing around the world. Europe's colonial expansion led to a global exchange of goods, flora and fauna, a shift towards European dominance, and the expansion of the slave trade. So what we see here is that Europeans are going to be exchanging goods and services across the globe. And this is also going to expand one of the ugliest chapters of human history, the slave trade. And that is definitely one of the things that we're going to get to. Although I'll just pause and point out that if you really want some information on the slave trade, that will be in a later cast that I'm doing right here, a little video review session. So if you look up topic 1.9, that's where I'm really going to get into the slave trade. So I'm not going to dive into the slave trade so much here. I want to really focus on something called the Columbian exchange. The exchange of new plants, animals, and disease. The Columbian exchange, in some cases, facilitated Europe's subjugation and destruction of indigenous peoples, particularly in the Americas. So now it's time to dive into what the Columbian exchange is. Maybe I'll go ahead and just expand this. It will take just a second to load. But as this is expanding, it's going to help us to understand what we're looking at. And if you'll remember that once Columbus discovers the Americas, and people are always pointing this out, that Columbus was not the first European to discover the Americas. We know that there were Vikings, Norsemen, from Iceland and from the Norwegian, these Norse countries, and even over into Greenland, and they started to explore parts of what is present-day Canada, centuries before Columbus. But what makes Columbus different is really the printing press. After Columbus discovered the Americas, he was able to get that information back to Europe, and that information was able to be disseminated, spread throughout Europe via this new printing technology. And so people started coming over by the boatload. And as Europeans came over, they started to bring back new goods with them. So here's what I like to point out. No European had ever seen corn or tomatoes or potatoes or pepper or tobacco or even the foundation of what chocolate is until the Americas were discovered. And that might not sink in right now. You might be like, oh, okay, that's not that big of a deal. But if you just pause and you think about Italian food, this is the example I always like to think of. When I think of Italian food, like spaghetti or pizza or lasagna, all of that is tomato-based, right? That marinara sauce, it's all tomato-based. No Italian, I guess, then had never really had Italian food until the Americas were discovered, because no Italian had ever touched a tomato before. When we think of potatoes in the United States, we think of French fries. And nobody in France had ever had a French fry, a potato, until the Americas were discovered. And when you think about chocolate, the best chocolate in the world is like Swiss chocolate or German chocolate or Belgian chocolate. Well, nobody in Europe had ever touched chocolate until the Americas were discovered. So this Columbian exchange is going to change everything. It might be one of the biggest concepts ever in this European history class. There were goods that were brought from the old world, that's Europe, Asia, and Africa, to the New World, North and South America. And a lot of this has to do with things that are needed for Christianity. You cannot do the sacrament, the bread and the wine, right, in remembrance of the body and the blood of Jesus, unless you have wheat, to make bread, or unless you have grapes to make wine. And so there were definitely products that were brought from the old world to the new world, changing how people eat, and there's more to it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of other things that Europeans bring over with them. In this little side box here, one of the most devastating things that Europeans bring with them is diseases. They didn't necessarily do this intentionally, although they do use it later intentionally in some regards. They brought horses. It seems archaeological evidence suggests that there were horses in the Americas before Europeans showed up, but they had been hunted to extinction. And all the historical documents we read when Europeans show up, the natives or the indigenous people of the Americas seem to be pretty thrown off by the horse. So by the time the Europeans showed up, Americans didn't have horses. So that's going to change everything about Native Americans. Guns, and of course, religion. And again, maybe one of the ugliest parts is bringing slaves over. The other thing I'd like to point out that it's a lot more complicated, right? This is showing you some of the diseases that are being brought over. Diseases go both ways. Smallpox, okay, even the plague, malaria. The smallpox is going to kill more people in North and South America than maybe died in the world wars. It's staggering, and it's also impossible to get accurate numbers. So that's why we kind of just leave it in this ambiguous millions of people. If you want to talk about a horrible plague, smallpox coming to the Americas when Europeans first showed up. There are diseases that go the other direction, sexually transmitted diseases. Europeans start to interact with the indigenous people. They start to mix. Most people in Mexico are of mixed blood. They're called mestizos. I don't know. Don't quote me on this. You can Google it later on. But some like 85% of people in Mexico are mestizo, a mix between Europe and native blood. And so that there are sexually transmitted diseases that started to show up in Europe after the Americas were discovered. But sometimes we like to focus on the foods. That's the fun part. The disease and the slavery is the ugly part. But the Columbian exchange is absolutely epic, and something that you need to understand in its scope because of how significant and serious it was. And so those are some of my slides that I used in class to try to teach people about this Columbian exchange. And as I pointed out later on, and I've used in other one of these video reviews, I did talk about, and it's later on here, this as you can see is number 12. I did bring up later on right here some of the ramifications of our own country. When we formed our country, we had to deal with slavery. And when we formed our country, we also had to deal with the fact that our ancestors kicked the Native Americans off their land and pushed them out. And the land that we now call our home was at one time native lands. So I kind of like this little joke here. Some Americans like to say America is for Americans, period. And I think the Native Americans would agree. It is for Americans. And a lot of our ancestors did some pretty brutal things. And those are some of the things that I've pointed out in class before. And I would encourage you, if you want to take more time, to go back and refresh your mind on what happened to native populations, after the colonization and some of the brutality that happened. It went both ways. Sometimes Europeans purposely use disease. There are some stories. There's a famous book by a guy named Jared Diamond. It's a pretty scholarly book. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it was written talking about maybe 90% of the native population was killed off by disease when the Europeans showed up. So sometimes that was done on accident, right? Somebody just shows up, they have this disease, they don't know they're contagious, they share it. But there's also some stories about Europeans taking somebody who has smallpox and rubbing a blanket on their body and then gifting that to a native village. They come back, a couple weeks, a month later, and the village is wiped out and dead and gone. So it's almost impossible to know how many millions of people died from this disease. But if there was a horrible pandemic in the history of the world, maybe the worst pandemic ever was the Black Death at the end of the Middle Ages in Europe. Everybody knows about the Black Plague, the Black Death. If there was a second plague that wiped out millions and millions and millions, it probably would have been after this Columbian exchange in the Americas. Who knows which one killed more people, but we're talking hundreds of millions of people who were killed in this plague. So just want to point out how significant that is. And in some cases, facilitated, allowed Europeans to take over. Sometimes they didn't even have to conquer Native Americans and take their lands because these Native Americans died of disease at such a high rate. So that's something that cannot be overemphasized. It's really significant. The next thing talks about illustrative examples of the period important Atlantic port cities. As was discussed before, during the Renaissance time, the power in Europe was on the Mediterranean. The countries that touched the Mediterranean held the power. But Italy's kind of beat up at the end of the 1400s, especially by France. And with the discovery of the Americas at the end of the 1400s, the power is going to shift to the countries that touch the Atlantic. So England, it's not the United Kingdom back then, it's going to be. Portugal, Spain, France, the Dutch countries, and England are going to become these seafaring empires. And the rest of this, like Central Europe, is going to kind of lag behind economically. They're going to be very powerful on the continent, don't get me wrong. But as far as these overseas territories and colonization, there's going to be a power shift away from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic states, especially with the discovery of the New World. So London, the capital of England, later the capital of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, located on the River Thames, famous center of banking and commerce. So if you go to England, and I've pointed this out on other reviews, but I'll go ahead and just repeat it for emphasis sake right here. I think it should be pointed out that this part of the island is England. This part of the island is Wales. This part of the island up here by Edinburgh and Glasgow, that's Scotland. And Ireland is for a long time going to be part of the United Kingdom. Today, only the northern part is. If you zoom in, you can see those labels there. And of course, London is probably the most financially powerful, important city on the planet Earth, even to this day. It really is amazing. And the River Thames dumps out into the ocean, and it flows right through London. And it's always been and is a center of commerce and a center of banking in the world. Bristol is a port city in Western England that served as a major trading hub. So if you zoom in, and you can go play around with Google Earth all you want, but there's where Bristol is, and it's right on the edge of Wales, and then you get into, Amsterdam is a major Dutch trading center and capital city of the Netherlands, the home of the first European stock market, and one of the wealthiest cities in the world during the 1600s. Again, the Dutch areas is the Netherlands and a lot of Belgium. And if you zoom in on Amsterdam, you can do a virtual tour, grab your little guy, do a street view, look at the canals. Amsterdam is an amazing city. Had my family there a couple years back, and my twin boys celebrated their 10th birthday in Amsterdam. It was kind of fun. There's another major city. I spent, a week in Antwerp when I was in college. I went and stayed with a Dutch guy there, and he gave me, a friend of mine, and he gave him a tour of all of the cities in Belgium, like Ghent and Bruges, and he actually lived just outside of Antwerp, and it was another major trading hub, a Dutch trading hub. Today, you'd find it in the country of Belgium. but a major Dutch port city, one of the busiest ports in Europe, still to this day, and located in the modern country of Belgium. Again, we've kind of talked about this, so I'm going to go over this quick, but there was new plants and animals and diseases. That's a part of this Columbian exchange. And you need to be aware what kind of stuff came from Europe to the Americas versus what are some of the things that came from the Americas to Europe. And if you want to have a further reference to that, I would encourage you, like I said, to come back to my notes and kind of take a look at it and try to get a grasp, a handle on what are some of the things that are affecting this Columbian exchange and what kind of an impact does that have. And just remember that pizza would never have existed if there hadn't have been the interaction of these two worlds. But there also may have been hundreds of millions of people who wouldn't have been died, and when we get into slavery, whew, it's going to be pretty horrific. But we'll save that for another time. This again is Mr. Moore signing off after reviewing topic 1.8, Colonial Expansion and the Columbian Exchange. Thanks for being here, guys.